Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Stephen Haselhorst. He's the Zero Trust Manager at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. Stephen, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Tom. Very excited about the opportunity.
And we should begin with the fact that you have just come over to the civilian side, to an agency with a huge and important mission, from the DoD side, where you were at the Air Force, another large agency with a huge and important mission. And what prompted the move, and what are you finding so far at FDIC?
I did 20 years of DoD service at different capacities, and my last position was a CTO for ACC Cyber. Very interesting role, but I had the opportunity to come into the federal space. Always interested in change, and this opportunity just was too hard to pass by. Love the challenges that they're experiencing, very similar to everybody's challenges, and loving the opportunity now at the FDIC.
All right, good. Well, let's get into the whole zero trust question, because it really impinges on a lot of areas of technology. It has a lot of legs, you might say. And I want to start with the network itself, because I think FDIC is very heavily into the cloud already as an agency. You know, some of the DoD agencies are more hybrid, perhaps. But in all cases, the network itself becomes more difficult to define, because you still have LANs and so forth in the office, but then you've got these connections to the regulated entities, to the cloud providers, and so on. So how do you define the network, and how do you decide where the zero trust quality ultimately has to live?
Yeah, so this is a phenomenal question, and it's a somewhat easy and difficult question to answer. I say difficult because today we can't define the network like we did. In the past, we had our perimeters that define our enclaves. We all lived inside of the network, the protected zone, and it was somewhat rather very easy to define what existed there. In today's world, it's not only a cloud environment, it's a multi-cloud hybrid environment. When I talk about hybrid, it's not just that we have resources on premise and resources in the cloud, but we also have individuals working on your traditional building type corporate office. And we have a large community that is mobile, a large community that is remote. After the pandemic, there's been a lot of adoption to keep the remote work going. So when you start trying to define your network, where do you go? It's really hard. You are all over the place. That's exactly the reason why we know that the current perimeter model is failed. The castle and moat no longer exists. And we need to think about zero trust and moving that perimeter closer to the applications, closer to the workload, and closer to where the data lives and moves. And really, that's why we're doing zero trust.
So in other words, the assets that you have to be concerned with are in some cases agency and government owned assets, but also assets that belong maybe to the cloud provider, to the commercial carriers, but nevertheless are being used to access ultimately data that you're trying to protect.
Absolutely. And with zero trust, it allows us to take advantage of the commercial offerings in a more secure way. So we need to leverage and capitalize on a lot of advancements that industry has done, whether it's in the cloud or it's in transport. And we can do that securely and improve by adopting zero trust principles.
And sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, I look at the FDIC just in this sense as similar to the EPA, because you have entities that you gather data from on a regular basis in the private sector, but nevertheless that are subject to FDIC oversight or regulation or resolution if the case, if worst comes to worst. And so you've also got that issue of it's their data, not necessarily the FDIC's, and they're coming at you from a variety of different setups out there that the different banks and so forth have for their own use.
100% correct. It's our data. It's a lot of banking data. It's a lot of information that they're trusting us to hold and protect. And like you said, we have to protect it no matter where it sits, where it stands, whether we have it and it's theirs or we created it and it's ours.
All right. Just maybe talk to us about what you learned in the Air Force, because you were doing zero trust type of work there. It's an imperative really across every federal entity, DoD or civilian. And what was the thinking there, and what have you picked up that might be useful here at the FDIC?
Yeah, so I'm glad to have had the opportunity so far to run through this multiple times and just taking the lessons learned and mistakes because we anticipate mistakes. We anticipate going down the wrong path and we're exploring. It's brand new. So I guess from that perspective, I had a lot of opportunities in the Air Force to grow a program, a fairly large program, and take the lessons learned of the things that worked really well for us and start bringing them into the FDIC. And from that perspective, we're able to potentially accelerate some of the work at the FDIC because we have those lessons learned.
And what are some of the big things you did learn? What are some of the lessons? What are some of the essential components of this whole zero trust that you've kind of bring a priori here to FDIC?
Sure. So I think the main thing is to make sure that you're fully organizing yourself around zero trust, that you're not operating as a pickup game, meaning that you have people working it as an additional duty, that they are supporting the effort part-time or whatnot. You really want to focus before you get into all the cool technology and that kind of stuff that everybody loves. You really have to focus on establishing your program, establishing your organization. And we absolutely got to do that in the Air Force. It took us a little bit of a while to get there. We established the Zero Trust Task Force, and that was the pivotal point, in my opinion, in the Air Force where we started making progress, real progress, towards a zero trust effort. And so at the FDIC, I'm bringing that from the beginning and establishing this dedicated workforce and task force.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you establish a program, establish an organization to get at this. So that implies it's not simply something that, by the way, to the CISO or to the CIO, well, tomorrow we're doing zero trust and we'll see you later, Charlie. This is something that is a programmatic approach. So who's in the program? Where does it live in the organization? How does it relate to the security people, to the CIO, and give us the kind of spider web of and where you are in it?
Yeah, so sure. From a FDIC perspective, we live inside of the CISO, so I report directly to the CISO. We see ourselves as a organization that has to interface with absolutely every stakeholder. So we have task owners that own particular tasks that are outside of our organization, but we make them part of our task force. We make sure that we're organizing in a way that we're heavily communicating. So communicating is essential. There's too many activities going on in every organization. It's not just ours, but any organization. So communication is important, and communication that you do it from a perspective of the zero trust program and what we need people to be doing. Because at the end of the day, I'm a program manager. I'm not executing. I'm asking others to change their mindset, change how they operate, change what they do, adopt, in some cases, adopt technology. In other cases, we've got the technology and just rethink about how we use that technology. So certainly a challenge. And I see myself more as an evangelist within the organization trying to carry the message and carry the plan forward.
And how do you relate to the traditional CISO or the information security or network security operations center operators who are essentially doing a different task that might not change that much because of the existence of zero trust, but yet could give them different clues, different data sets, and so forth to inculcate into what they normally do?
Yeah, that's an awesome question because it's an experience that I think every zero trust practitioner has to deal with. You deal with the organization and the established processes and established ways of doing business, and this is how we've done it forever kind of situation. And you got to work with them to try to understand what the future holds, where we're going, what we're trying to do. It's tough because we need to continue to maintain the current state of what we're doing as we're evolving. But what I find for the most part is people are extremely excited of zero trust once they understand it, once they start capturing what they need to do. So a lot of time we spend just explaining how their world is changing. In many cases, the world is not really changing. It's shifting a little bit. It's shifting the mindset or shifting the areas they look at. But I find that they're very excited about the change itself.
And within the zero trust organization that is within the CISO chain, what kind of people do you need to assemble? What size will your team be? And what kinds of skills do you need to do the zero trust work?
Yeah, excellent. So, believe it or not, and I'm a techie, and so I like thinking about technology and engineers and whatnot. But some of the first things that you really want to get after is good program management, good program managers that can help you with establishing the program properly, ensuring that we have worked properly, the funding streams, how are we going to support this effort? And then, of course, we're going to need zero trust experts, and they're actually really hard to come by. And sometimes you have to be willing to understand that you got to grow an individual that is really strong in cybersecurity, it's really strong in networking or identity, and grow them into this mindset and bring them along into the picture. So you might not, as an organization, be able to find zero trust me's. They're pretty hard to come by, but you can take traditional network security people, work with them, educate them, and get them to support your staff. You want to have architects that can help you define the architecture of the environment, and then you want to have SMEs for the different pillar areas so that we can start working with the different organizations and shape how an identity program is ran, for instance, or shape how our devices are monitored or managed, and so on and so forth. So that's you need the engineers to help shape those directions, but you ultimately need a good program management team.
And for developing those SMEs, or if you don't have them or you need to develop them, is there a reference body of work? Is there coursework and so on where people can go to become an SME in zero trust?
Yeah, so it's almost like you're reading my email. I'm growing my team right now, and I tell my team that it took me a long time to develop myself as a zero trust expert and establish my own core beliefs around zero trust. We all should start, of course, with NIST 800-207, get a good understanding of how that was drafted. That was an excellent body of work. I actually tell people to go back to the original days of Google Beyond Corp. They published a lot of papers when they first started their efforts. And in some ways, they took the theory that was being talked about and actually put it into action. So their work is very interesting. There's some books like the Zero Trust book by Jason Garbus that I highly recommend. Some certifications that are being let out now by Forrester, who is the leader on kind of established with John Kandervag on establishing zero trust. So the resources are almost endless. I think people need to read into all of them, try to understand the concepts, but at the end of the day, zero trust has to become something that becomes your own, that you understand what it means for you. You understand what it means for the organization. Once you do that, you need to get the organization all understanding the same principles, the same concepts, so that we're all marching in the same way.
It's almost like you're a special forces operation team within FDIC to try to establish this.
Yeah, it's a funny way to put it. Yeah.
And I'm not reading your email. If I could, then you wouldn't have zero trust in place yet, I suppose. And you're getting good, to use the Air Force metaphor, air support from the CISO, the CIO, and general management at FDIC.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sylvia Burns, she's our CIO. She heads up the Interagency Zero Trust Committee. Is one of the reasons why I decided to join. I knew she was passionate about zero trust and she wanted to advance it. My CISO, Zach Brown, absolutely a firm believer of zero trust, and he's the one that created the position. Where my role is nothing more to work towards the agency's zero trust. So having leaders like that are willing to commit the energy, the resources, and put the people behind it, it's what's important. If you don't have leadership support, if you don't have their buy-in, it's going to be a hard road to travel. So I always tell people getting those guys involved and getting those guys following is important, and FDIC certainly has that.
And let's get a little bit into the nitty gritty here. You mentioned the pillar areas, the elements of the zero trust architecture. Let's review what they are actually.
Yeah, so there's pillars pillars or tenants. If you look at the NIST 800-207, all can be somewhat very informative, helpful, but I really look at some kind of essential areas that people need to focus on. You won't find a zero trust practitioner that won't tell you to start with your identity management. Your identity management is critical. You need to have a full understanding of all your users, whether they're internal, external, somewhat of a centralized repository. You need to elevate, and this is something that the federal government is quite far along on implementing MFA, where some commercial industry and whatnot might have not been adopting multi-factor authentication principles. The DoD and the federal government have made that front and center right before zero trust was cool. So getting MFA in place is certainly important. From a zero trust perspective, there's a game changer where identity is important, and we do talk about an identity-based approach to data, but we also calculate the device. Our device that's connecting means a lot. I can control my device. I can manage my device. That gives me a certain level of confidence. And if I can prove it better, I might have BYOD connections. And where zero trust allows us to start getting clever is that I can grant access from a BYOD device to a limited set of data or a limited set of resources that might be less risk or just simply necessary, and you accept the risk, where I can now determine only giving access to resources from devices that are not only managed, but fully compliant from a security standard that we've established. Another one is microsegmentation, and that's not talked enough about, I think, and it's really one of my favorites. When we talk about zero trust, we actually talk about, instead of prevent compromise, we talk about assume compromise. And that's what zero trust comes in. We assume that the environment can or will be compromised. So how are you going to change your architecture to defend against potentially having compromised assets connecting to you? If you are compromised, how are you going to prevent that threat or that attack from spreading further from where it started? So segmentation of your network is essential. And then the visibility. The visibility aspect of zero trust is critical. We need to be able to have the visibility we've probably never had in the past. Our security teams traditionally have focused on that perimeter on the enclave, where we kind of call it the choke point or the bottleneck. And you can see everything coming in and out, and you can monitor it. You can get events and alerts. In a zero trust world, all of that is happening now in the cloud. It's happening on premise. It's happening on Starbucks with your user's machine just working as a teleworker. So you need to rethink your visibility so that you have the right visibility or the right data points and telemetry that you're getting from every one of those edge points. And then ultimately, it's going to get you to the data. The data is what we all seek to protect. That's the whole point of zero trust. But I always like to tell people, you need to start with the core foundational elements so that you can get to protecting the data. For those that will start, and the phrase is used, it's all about the data quite often. For those that start trying to solve the data problem first, they'll be very frustrated. They'll spend a lot of money, probably a little return on investment, because you need to have foundational elements. If your ICAM is not straight, there's no way you're going to be able to restrict data to specific users, and et cetera.
And when you talk about the devices and the telemetry of the devices and understanding, especially in the BYOD context, it's almost like an Internet of Things exercise, because you've got your identity for your people, but then the identity of those things, you really have to understand them. I'm thinking, what do you do about a user device that might be useful for that person's work on your own networks, but they also have TikTok or something on that device? That's the kind of telemetry you have to be able to have to see and make sure that that's either removed or doesn't have access to any of the other sources of data.
Yeah, so from the most part, it's not necessarily that we try to be the fun police and eliminate TikTok or eliminate any of the social media aspects, but we need to be able to, on that device aspect, control to the point that we can assure or closely assure that that device is not being controlled by a command and control server. It doesn't have malware on it, and it's not going to those destinations that could become a pass-through because you've established command and control to a malware environment, and now you're a bot of sorts that is attacking your network. So you certainly need to monitor where your devices are going, what they're doing, and ideally provide some kind of control what they can do.
And what is your source of identity management? Is it simply your directory of users, that derive from Active Directory, or is there some other database that's more effective for zero trust purposes?
Yeah, so for everybody, it'll be a little bit different. I think a lot of us are starting out with Active Directory is just so present all over the world, but many are now looking at modern identity providers. There's many cloud-based, or whether you're managing it yourself, where they allow you to have a master user record, a single source of truth. You could be federating to other identity providers, but you do have to have that master user record with that single source of truth that has the attributes that define the user. So I think we'll see in the future more and more of us moving away from necessarily Active Directory being the source of truth and leveraging more of the modern identity providers that make it easier for us to do that.
And multi-factor authentication is a big push and has been for a long time. My sense is that what was talked about, say, by agencies a number of years ago, which is biometrics, is really giving away to the one-time code type of model for most users. Is that your perception? And what are you doing there with MFA?
Yeah, so absolutely. So it's the first thing you want to do with MFA is you want to have a FIDO compliant MFA solution. You want to be able to have, at least for your critical systems, have anti-phishing resistant capabilities. What we mean by that is the one-time passwords, the emails that you receive. There's always a possibility for somebody to perform a phishing campaign and steal that one-time password that comes your way. So we want to move into a FIDO compliant type environment. And biometrics and the passwordless world is really where we need to get at. There's enough already that's been surfacing in industry of going into a passwordless world. And I encourage anybody and everybody to try to seek and make it into the roadmap to eventually get to where it's your fingerprint, it's your face, it's your something that you can use that is completely passwordless and allows you to eliminate even yet another point of compromise, because you can't try to hack or guess a password when you're not using passwords.
So biometrics is in fact very much a part of this.
So biometrics is very much a part of it. I would consider it an advanced capability for some that are smaller or some that maybe have already made some headway in their MFA. They might be ready to start adopting some biometrics. What I see for the most part is that we're all looking at biometrics as a phenomenal game changer opportunity, but we're probably not ready to start saying that biometrics is the only way to do it.
All right. And if a biometric is one of the factors, then the other one is an RSA token type of thing.
So when you're using biometrics, the device that you're using to establish your biometrics is one factor, and then yourself, the identity or the how you're using it is how you're establishing that connectivity. So it's the ultimate way to identify yourself without having to have complicated passwords or anything like that.
Got it. So it's the serial number, in effect, of the device that becomes one of the factors.
Sure.
All right. And well, I'm looking at these pillars, and you mentioned identity management, a central repository, some form of multi-factor authentication, and so on, microsegmentation and telemetry tools into your endpoints and so forth. It's often said zero trust is not a product you buy, but it does sound like there is some investment needed to orient things to get these pillars in place. Maybe discuss what some of and you mentioned earlier that you need to make sure the team understands how to secure the funds to do this. What are the cost elements here?
Yeah, there's plenty of cost elements. When I go into an organization, we try to assess and try to determine what existing investments and what existing resources they have applied that just need maybe a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of altering. I don't think anybody should walk in and say, hey, I need a blank check and I'm going to buy everything brand new. We can't afford that, and most can't. And many of the capabilities we have can't support. But there is certainly a need for, if your identity is not centralized, if you have multiple identity providers in your enterprise, then you're going to have to fund a capability to do a centralized identity provider. You're going to have to fund the capability to provide some zero trust network access capabilities. And when I say zero trust network access, many conflate that with remote access. And it's not remote access. It's zero trust network access applies on-premise, local, remotely. It's a way to make sure that we are validating both the identity and both the device and any external context for that solution. So if you don't have anything in place that can support that, that might be an investment that you would have to do. You want to try to migrate as much as possible to leveraging cloud resources to perform some of your device patching, your device EDR capabilities. And we say this because we now assume that the network is agnostic and you're operating from anywhere. So we don't want to depend on the traditional local network to give me security services to my laptop or to my device. We want to make sure that those security services, whether it's an EDR, whether it's patching or hygiene, are done consistently at all times. So
yes, I was going to say, it sounds like the difference between remote access and just regular, what used to be, say, in office or on the LAN access, the whole concept kind of goes away because it's all zero trust access. That's what you're driving at.
So I'm glad you put it that way. Yeah, you said it better than I did, because I want to make sure people understand that it's not remote access. It's zero trust network access. Doesn't matter where you are, we're going to treat you the same. And that's what allows us even more of the flexibility that we have had in the past. Because if I no longer make a determination based on the network I'm giving you access, then you can really be operating from any location in the world. And I'm going to validate and challenge you exactly the same, ensure that you are who you are and you have the device that you need to have. And then I can give you access. It gives us so much flexibility and freedom.
And by the way, does it then mean you don't need VPNs anymore?
We're going to need VPNs for a while as we transition. Some of the zero trust network access solutions look and feel a little bit like VPNs. They're kind of the next evolution or the next generation of VPNs. One of the main differences is that the users don't come to one centralized choke point, but you're establishing the connections to multiple perimeters and multiple locations across your enterprise, because it's now in the cloud or it's now on the network. So VPNs, the biggest problem we have with VPNs is that they make the false assumption that they're extending the internal network to that user and giving them blanket access to every resource on the network. And CTNA changes that. You only will see the applications that you have to work with.
It almost becomes a mesh where every person is.
It does. Yeah.
And you mentioned a lot of the services such as identity management can reside as cloud services, but say the logic of denial, I mean, literally the code, the logic that says this person is not allowed, or this device is not authorized, or this person is authorized, but not for this data. Where does that all reside?
So that resides in what we call a policy decision point. And a policy decision point for some vendors is an integrated solution with what we call a policy enforcement point. But the policy decision point really is the key to your environment. Your identity access solution will make some decisions to grant and authorize and provide, for instance, a SAML token to a resource, but they're not going to be the final decision. Then it's passed to an actual policy decision point within your enterprise that will do the calculus. Some call it risk score, determine all of the factors for the policy. And at that point, that user, even with a valid identity, could be denied access because they don't meet all of the controls. Or we can make a decision to say, you're meeting some, so I'm going to give you access to the low threat applications until you get fixed. You can't get access to the higher profile applications. So that the policy decision point is certainly key.
And is that a dynamic type of program to learn and adapt as time goes on?
So the decision point has what we like to call an established policy, and the access that they provide or the permissions that they grant are all dynamic. So no longer do we have static policies or static rules in firewalls where they say subnet A can get to subnet B, but we create on the fly provisions or mini firewalls, if you want to call it that, in order to grant that access dynamically at the time of need. From an external factor, which we like to call context, we want to incorporate, and this is getting into higher maturities, but we want to incorporate with user behavior analytics, whatever your SIEM and SOAR are seeing, whatever indicators of compromise exist. And we want to fuse that in. So we want to have API first kind of technologies that will receive a feed. And even though everything in the policy says Steve Haselhorst should access, there's indicators in our analytics that say Steve Haselhorst is executing risky behaviors. So you got a choice to make there, whether you're going to grant them access and investigate or just deny them access and investigate.
Because years ago, there was even talk about haptic considerations, someone's typing pattern or their pressures or their, whatever those habits are, almost like gait in walking, is a great identifier. Is that still part of all this?
So I'll tell you, it was an interesting research idea many years ago and talked a lot. I can't say that people aren't doing that, but I'm not seeing it a lot in the industry that we're using. I'm sure there's a couple of niche products that do that, but we're not seeing it a lot in the industry that we're trying to follow the how you're typing in the keyboard to determine whether we grant you access or not.
All right. And what about machine to machine interactions? We've been talking about mainly what you would consider people accessing the network, but there's a lot of automated access and automated back and forth, especially I would think in an FDIC setting with the reporting that has to go on between the banks and the regulated entities. And what are some special considerations for machine to machine zero trust?
Yeah, so what I would probably say is that we try not to make anything special. A machine to machine connection should follow the same principles of zero trust. It's not a human being logging in, but you want to authenticate that connection with the distant end. You want to encrypt that connection. You want to ensure that you're micro-segmenting to the point where that system or that connection can only do specifically what it's supposed to do, and it can't laterally move to other systems. So sure, there's a different dynamic, but we try to look at it almost in the same way. A machine-to-machine connection or a user-to-machine connection has to follow the same principles. There is a challenge, and I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit harder, and it gets a little bit more challenging when we start talking about IoT devices. So when you have smart devices that are machine-to-machine connecting, you can implement a lot of this authentication between machines. You can implement a lot of the encryption. When you get an IoT device from industry and it's sitting in your network and you really don't have a way to configure it or manipulate it, what we talk there is you need to segment that enclave, segment that network of IoT devices and keep them tightly monitored so you can see what they're doing. There are vendors that are doing machine learning analytics to kind of follow the patterns of what your IoT environment normally does, so they can discover if there's some malicious activity. But by micro-segmenting them, you have now the ability to provide that visibility on it, the ability to react, and the ability to contain that threat. If a thermostat is compromised, you want to make sure that thermostat has no way of reaching your data center.
Yes, because even though these devices might be small or low power, they're running some code. And in many cases, the malicious code you want to keep out are very small files that could actually be launched from an IoT device.
Correct. And in some cases, unfortunately, they're running code, and they're running code that's not being maintained. For most of the responsible organizations, they maintain and update their patches. I'm talking about industry. But there are a lot of things that people buy that maybe were cool at the moment. You installed it, you used it, but it lost support, and it's not getting a lot of patches or a lot of update from a security standpoint. So
I just got my first Wi-Fi thermostat in my house, and I look at that thing with suspicion now because it's way into into our computers at home, and therefore into almost anywhere in the world. And well, where are you? Where is FDIC in this long journey then between the concepts we talk about and everyone facing the zero trust challenge?
Yeah, so we're in our beginner steps. We're establishing our team. We're establishing what we want from a roadmap, from a strategy, from a vision perspective. We want to establish the future budgets that we need to be able to materialize this. We're in the education phase. I spend a lot of time hosting lunch and learns and a lot of time talking with people and educating. As much as we all engineers want to gravitate to the technology, the people concept of zero trust is probably one of the hardest. And you got to work your hardest to get champions across the organization. One person's not going to do it. So you got to build that community of champions that are going to help you promote the zero trust costs across every corner of the organization.
And who do you enlist in that particular pursuit? It can't be just the technical organization, but program people and group, unit leaders, those types of folks?
100%. Yeah. So the engineers are always cool to talk to because we relate a lot, but you have to also work into your business language. You have to be willing to reach out to the business owners. They're the ones that are going to be somewhat impacted. Their application is going behind a zero trust access control architecture. They need to understand why and what's in it for them, how they benefit. As you're growing into the organization, you got to talk to your finance organization and have them understand what you're doing and why you're doing it so that they can support you. So the building the champions goes across whether it's the IT community, the cyber community, and also all of the support structure that you have in your organization.
And let's talk about users themselves for a moment, because the cliche is that cybersecurity measures, the stronger they get, the more they are challenging to users who find workarounds. But the way you've described zero trust for the average user, say that PC or that mobile device, and it has its own unique identifier, that's factor one. That person's face could be factor two. That sounds like a great simplification of the whole cyber that people face.
Yeah, so I love that question. And when I do my presentations, I have a slide that I call the zero trust myths. And one of the myths that I try to dispel is that zero trust will impact user experience. Because just like you said, as I'm building into my presentation, I'm telling them all the cool things that we're going to be able to do to protect the data. The traditional reaction from people is cybersecurity has always come here and just added another thing and made it harder and made it harder and made it harder. And my user experience sucks because I can't connect. In the Air Force, we kind of quickly realized and coined the term that with zero trust, this is the first time that we see that we can improve security without impacting user experience, or vice versa, improve user experience without impacting security. Traditionally, it's been a trade-off where you have to kind of decide where's your risk and how much you want to allow for a cybersecurity threat in order to give a good user experience. Zero trust just makes it to where people are using single sign-on. They're actually getting to the resources directly. It's faster, and they can have a much more rich experience than they have had in the past.
And in designing the program, we mentioned a lot of the pillars and a lot of the capabilities that they represent. Is there a best order of events for doing this, or do you try to roll it out and flip it on one day? I mean, how do you actually effectuate all of this?
Yeah, so I think it's all about, everybody's going to have a different path. It's all about understanding your environment that you're in, the maturity that you might have in different areas, and then trying to focus where you might have the biggest bang for your buck. For most organizations that haven't adopted MFA, I would almost say stop what you're doing and go after MFA. Get MFA in place, get that working, mature your identity access management solution, and then start working towards others. That doesn't mean that when I say stop, you can work parallel threads, but I think that's where you want to start. You want to make sure that you hit the areas that your organization is maybe not as mature and will have the biggest bang for your buck. And the example MFA is a good one.
And when dealing with clouds, commercial cloud providers, they have catalogs of services that run to thousands and thousands of offerings. Are any of their native offerings that you can maybe get as part of your service level agreement or pay a little extra for pursuant to zero trust?
100%. So zero trust has become a kind of the big boom in IT right now, where we have emerging capabilities coming from every vendor. I do want to ask people to be cautious, kind of form your opinions first, kind of understand what it is that you want before you allow yourself to get immersed into the vendor market, because you'll be absolutely overwhelmed. I think there's people who've been online talking about, we used to go to conferences 3 years ago, and there was maybe like 1 or 2 booths that had zero trust. If you go to a conference today, every single booth will have zero trust. So you got to watch out to make sure that you're not fooled by something that might be zero trust or might not be zero trust. So think about that. But yeah, the industry is evolving in a way that is enabling federal government to adopt a lot of those capabilities and really push us forward tremendously.
And coming from 20 years in the DoD realm, you know all about the color of money, and different projects require different colors of money. But even in the civilian side, there's operation and maintenance money, there's new project development money. Some of them get better treatment than others, depending on who you're dealing with appropriators and agency leadership. Where does zero trust fall from a fiscal standpoint? And what's your recommendation to make sure that the money gets there that you need?
Yeah, so from at least my experiences, I'm sure every organization is different, but the first thing is to have initiative money to start planning. So you want to be able to establish this team that I've talked about, the program. So you want to have initiative money that doesn't result in it doesn't deliver any actual product as far as the technology that you've deployed, but you get the opportunity to start planning what you're going to do, what's your strategy, what's your roadmap, what's your way forward, coordinating with stakeholders. And then, of course, after that, you need to have your implementation and operations money. And the operations money is probably the most important and sometimes overlooked. We can go into cool tech and go and buy all the coolest shiny objects and bring them in and deploy them. But if we forgot to plan for operations, who's going to feel that? Who's going to receive it? Who's going to run it and day-to-day maintain it? You will absolutely fail. So I see a lot of people failing in that latter part of not considering how you're going to manage operations.
And just a couple of quick questions. Do you have a test bed type of isolated network to test these concepts and pillars on, or can you deploy them directly to the operational network of the agency?
No, so I think you certainly could. A lot of them are proven. A lot of them are FedRAMP. A lot of them are approved and have been deployed in many networks. But I would certainly recommend that you start with test beds, you start with MVPs, you start with areas where you can learn, you can make mistakes. I think John Kendervag talks about starting with your least important application, because you never want to start with your crown jewel, because if you screw up with your crown jewel, you're having a big mission impact and your program is shot. So make your mistakes with the little stuff, make your mistakes learning how to do those things. And once you kind of master it or mature, then you work your way straight into the crown jewels, because in zero trust, you never know if you're really going to reach the full maturity of hitting every corner of your environment, but you certainly want to start with the critical components and protecting those first.
Sure. I guess the blow to reputation could be worse than the blow to the network itself if you're not careful.
Correct.
And final question, what about the use of shared services? Maybe some agency already has this thing going and you don't need to reinvent it for your own agency.
Yeah, so that's my favorite, right? So, and the federal government is doing this quite well. Whether it's a shared service, actually DOJ has some shared services that they're offering, and you can learn from their mistakes, and you can bring a solution that maybe has a little bit more maturity. But it's not just the shared services, but the community that has come across in the federal space for zero trust, where people are hosting events and hosting collaboration, just simple meetings, discussing what they're doing, where they're at, what they've learned, what mistakes they've made, are absolutely critical. So taking advantage of shared services is absolutely great, but it's not just that. It's also taking advantage of the SMEs that are trying to bang their head on the wall, making progress and learning from them.
You want to keep your SMEs happy and not banging their head on the wall. Stephen Haselhorst is the Zero Trust Manager at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Thanks so much for joining us and for such a great discussion.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed every minute of it and appreciate it.
And I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Zero Trust Cyber Exchange.